Alessio Farnese threw the Curvy Maid out of his mansion at gunpoint, in front of every captain who had ever feared him, and he told her that if her shadow ever crossed the Farnese gate again, he would bury her in the same soil as his father. He believed he had just crushed a traitor. He believed pride had saved his empire. What he did not know, as Cora Whitlock walked barefoot down that long, white gravel drive with a shattered marble angel behind her, was that his dying godfather had already written the script of his humiliation. Within 9 days, this same feared boss of Chicago would be on his knees inside an abandoned funeral home, weeping, begging a woman in a housekeeping uniform to come back and save the empire he had just used her body as a doormat for. Why had she smashed his father's holy statue in front of 11 captains? Why did the old godfather, Enzo Marcelli, refuse to speak a single word in her defense when he loved her like a daughter? And why, when the maid vanished, did the Farnese enemies suddenly attack every single location she had touched, only to fail as if someone had rewritten the future itself? Cora Whitlock had lived inside the Lake Forest estate for 18 months, and in those 18 months she had become invisible, in the useful way that quiet women become invisible to loud men. She was 33, curvy in the soft, disciplined way of someone who had spent a decade lifting elderly patients in and out of hospital beds before the Mafia hired her. Her uniform was plain gray cotton, her shoes were rubber-soled, and her hair was pinned up so tightly that Alessio Farnese, 52 years old and drowning in his own authority, had never once actually looked at her face in the 18 months she had walked past him carrying trays. He looked at her tray. He looked at her polished silverware. He looked past her the way a rich man looks past a doorknob. Enzo Marcelli looked at her, though. Enzo was 78 and dying of pancreatic cancer, and dying men see the people the living have stopped seeing. He had been in and out of the Mayo Clinic 3 times that autumn, and the doctors had finally sent him home with a small brown bottle and a soft voice, and he had accepted the sentence the way old men accept weather. He had 6 weeks, maybe 8, if the drip was kind. He had 1 grandson to hand a family to, and that grandson was drowning without knowing it. Every morning she brought Enzo his oatmeal, his blood thinners, his fentanyl patch, and every morning Enzo studied her over the rim of his cup and said the same thing. You notice things, Cora. You notice when the salt cellar is moved 1 inch. You notice when the drapes have been touched. Someday I will need those eyes of yours. She had laughed politely and refilled his water. She did not know that morning was already coming. It came on a Tuesday morning in October. Enzo asked her to close the study door, and then he asked her to lock it. She locked it. Then he told her that someone inside the Farnese family had been feeding their enemies for 6 months. Every shipment that failed, every safe house that got raided, every captain who died in a parking garage, all of it was leaking from inside the house. He was too weak to hunt the traitor with muscle. He needed a servant. He needed her. He gave her 3 instructions. Watch which objects moved in the great room. Watch which men lingered near the fireplace where the family council always sat. And when he gave her the signal, she was to walk into the middle of a leadership meeting and smash the marble statue of Alessio's late father, take 1 specific piece from inside its hollow base, and refuse to explain herself no matter what Alessio did to her. He warned her that Alessio would be cruel. He warned her that Alessio would humiliate her. He warned her that Alessio might, in a very bad moment, order her killed, and that Enzo would have to allow it to look real. If she was not willing to walk into that room knowing all 3 of those things, he would find another way. She said there was no other way. He had already tried the others. Both of them knew it. She asked him if Alessio would be told. Enzo did not answer. He simply reached across the desk and covered her hand with his cold, papery one, and said, "Child, if I tell him, he will fail the test, and if he fails the test, he will not survive me by a month. Do you understand what I am asking of you?" She understood. She said yes anyway. That is the kind of woman she was. She went back to her small servant's room that night and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and did not sleep. She thought about her mother, who had died in a nursing home in Peoria 5 years earlier, with a strange man's dinner tray still on her lap because the aide had been in a hurry. She thought about the 18 months she had spent in this Farnese mansion, changing Enzo's sheets, ironing Alessio's collars, being spoken over at every meal. She thought about the fact that a dying old man had, for the first time in her adult life, looked at her and seen a mind instead of a pair of hands. And she made her peace with what was coming. Whatever the cost was, she would pay it, because she had spent 33 years being told her steady hands were only good for other people's laundry, and now, finally, someone was asking those hands to hold the fate of a family. She would not fumble it, not even if it cost her every scrap of dignity she had left. Before we go one step further into the storm that swallowed this house, do me one favor. If you have ever been underestimated by a man who thought your quiet meant weakness, tap that like button right now and subscribe, because what this maid does next is exactly what every overlooked woman has dreamed of doing at least once. I promise you, the payoff is worth it. The leadership meeting was on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later, and the great room smelled of cigar smoke and old money. 11 captains sat in a semicircle around the fireplace. Alessio stood at the mantel in a black three-piece suit, one hand resting on the marble statue of his father, the way a king rests his hand on a scepter. Lucian Ferraro, the underboss, sat closest to him. Lucian was 48, silver at the temples, always smiling with the top half of his face while the bottom half stayed perfectly still. He had served the Varnese family for 20 years. Alessio trusted him more than he trusted his own reflection. Cora entered with a silver coffee service. She set it on the sideboard. She poured for Enzo, who was hunched in a wheelchair by the window, an oxygen line running under his nose. Enzo lifted 2 fingers off the arm of the chair. That was the signal. Cora walked to the fireplace. She set the coffee pot down on the marble hearth with the same care she would have used any other evening. She picked up the fireplace poker, and in one clean, terrible motion, she swung it into the marble face of Alessio's father. The statue exploded. Chips of white marble skittered across the Persian rug. Every captain in the room came to his feet with a weapon halfway drawn. Alessio did not move. His face did not change. That was the thing about Alessio that made him dangerous. When ordinary men shouted, Alessio went still. And when Alessio went still, someone usually died. Cora knelt in the wreckage, reached her hand into the hollow base of the statue, and withdrew a small black object no larger than a quarter. She closed her fist around it. She stood up. She looked Alessio in the eye for the first time in 18 months. "Explain," Alessio said. His voice was almost gentle. "I can't," she said. "You just destroyed the last thing on this earth that still carried my father's face. You will explain, or I will make you explain." "I can't, Mr. Varnese." Lucian Ferraro spoke then, his voice full of the sad, reasonable poison of a man who has been waiting his whole life for this exact moment. "Boss," he said softly, "the woman has lost her mind. Or she has been paid. Either way, letting her live inside this house one more night is a message to every enemy we have. It says the Varnese name can be spit on by a maid." Alessio's eyes never left Cora's face. He crossed the room slowly. He took her chin between his thumb and forefinger, not roughly, almost thoughtfully, and turned her face toward the light. 18 months, he said. 18 months I have fed you, housed you, trusted you around my godfather's medicine. And this is how you pay the Varnese name." He let go of her chin. He turned to his security chief, Tomas Belli. "Get her off my property. Tonight. No car, no coat. If she is on Varnese soil after midnight, you shoot her in the driveway and leave her for the rain." Tomas hesitated. He looked at Enzo. Enzo was staring at the floor. Enzo said nothing. That silence was the loudest thing in the room, and Alessio heard it, and it enraged him more than the broken statue, because his godfather had raised him from the age of 26, and his godfather had never once refused to defend a Varnese ally in front of the captains. And now his godfather was letting a maid be thrown into the November night without lifting a single finger. Alessio took it as permission. It was not permission. It was a verdict. Cora walked out of the great room, past the 11 captains, past Lucian Ferraro's small, polite smile, past the marble dust on her shoes. She did not look back. She did not cry. She walked down the long, white gravel drive in her gray cotton uniform, and Tomas Belli walked 5 paces behind her, with a gun in his belt he did not want to use. At the wrought iron gate she turned to him, only briefly, and pressed something into his hand. A folded slip of paper. She closed his fingers over it. Then she walked out onto the county road and disappeared into the dark. The rain started 10 minutes after she vanished, a cold Illinois November rain that soaked through her gray cotton uniform inside of a mile, and she did not stop walking until she reached the bus shelter on Route 41. She sat on the plastic bench there for 40 minutes, wet through, waiting for a bus she never intended to board, because she needed the security cameras at that shelter to record a woman who looked exactly like a maid who had been thrown out of a house. When the bus arrived, she let it pass. When the cameras cycled, she stepped off the bench and walked north through a service alley to the little rental car Enzo had parked for her behind a shuttered dry cleaner. She drove west into the city with her hands shaking on the wheel, and she did not cry until she was safely inside the abandoned Marcelli funeral home 3 hours later. And then she cried very quietly, and then she stopped, because Enzo had not asked her to grieve. He had asked her to win. Tomas Belli read the paper in the guardhouse 15 minutes later. Then he burned it. Then he did exactly what it told him to do. For 3 days, the Varnese estate was quiet, the way a house is quiet after a wake. Alessio buried himself in work. He told himself he had done the right thing. A boss does not tolerate defiance. A boss does not let a servant humiliate him in front of his own captains. He said these things to his reflection in the bar mirror at 2 in the morning, and the reflection did not agree with him, and this made him drink another glass. On the 4th day, the phone calls started. Their trucking depot on the south side was hit at dawn. Except that when Lucian's rival, the Mancuso family, kicked in the loading bay doors expecting 80 crates of contraband, they found 80 crates of sand. The Varnese men were already gone. Nobody died. Nobody was even scratched. Their cash count house in Cicero was raided the same night. Except that when the Bratva strike team blew the safe was empty. The cash had been moved 48 hours earlier, according to a schedule change that nobody in the current leadership remembered authorizing. The Martelli warehouse on the docks caught fire, except that the warehouse had been emptied a week before, and the fire consumed nothing except an insurance policy that paid out at triple book value. 3 attacks, 3 failures, 3 enemies who had clearly known exactly where the Varnese were vulnerable, and 3 enemies who had clearly been fed the wrong day, the wrong hour, the wrong crate. Somebody inside the Varnese house had been leaking, and somebody inside the Varnese house had been re-leaking the leaks, twisting them 1 degree off true, turning every enemy strike into an empty punch. The rival bosses were now openly laughing at the Mancuso and the Bratva in every bar between Chicago and Milwaukee. And one veteran captain from Kenosha had already sent Alessio a bottle of Barolo with a card that read simply, "Well played, boss." Alessio had thrown the bottle against the wall of the wine cellar. He had not played anything. He was the last man in his own house who understood the game that was being played on the board he was standing on. Alessio understood, standing on the burnt dock at 4 in the morning with soot on his cuffs, that his empire was being defended by a ghost. And the ghost had walked out of his front gate in a gray cotton uniform. He tried to remember her face on that walk down the driveway. He could not. He could remember the marble dust on her shoes. He could remember the exact angle of the poker in her hand. He could not remember whether her eyes had been brown or gray, and this small failure of memory bothered him more than the burnt warehouse behind him, because a man does not need to remember the eyes of a servant, but a man had better remember the eyes of the person who has just saved his life 3 times in 96 hours. He went back to the estate and tore his own house apart with his bare hands. He unscrewed lamp bases. He gutted the backs of picture frames. He shattered the crystal decanters on the bar. Inside the base of the reading lamp on his father's old desk, he found a transmitter the size of a lentil. Inside the frame of his mother's wedding portrait, another. Inside the wooden knob of the great room's fireplace bellows, a third. Someone had wired the Varnese house like a confession booth, and someone had been listening to every leadership meeting for months. He also found, when he pried apart the marble base of the shattered statue in the corner where the maid had dropped it, the mounting bracket for a fourth device. But the device itself was gone. She had taken it. She had walked out of the house carrying the thing that could name the traitor. And now she was somewhere in Chicago, alone, with the only evidence he needed to save his own life. Lucien Ferraro found him on the floor of the great room with marble dust in his hair. "Boss," Lucien said gently, "the maid took the master unit. She controls the whole network. She is the traitor. She has always been the traitor. Enzo is old and sentimental, and she used that." Alessio did not answer. Lucien tried again. "Let me handle it. Give me 12 men in 48 hours. I will bring you her body and the device, and this ends by Sunday." Alessio said, "No." Lucien blinked. "Boss, I said no. You do not touch her. You do not send anyone to touch her. If a hair on that woman's head is disturbed before I say otherwise, I will hold you personally responsible, Lucien, in front of every captain in this house. Do you understand me?" Lucien inclined his head an inch, a gesture of obedience so small and so precise that a younger Alessio would have missed it. The older Alessio, standing knee-deep in marble dust and lentil-sized transmitters, did not miss it. Something in his stomach turned over. He had known Lucien for 20 years, and in 20 years Lucien had never once tilted his head like a man biting down on his own tongue. Because for the first time since Cora had left, Alessio's stillness had come back, and when Alessio went still, someone usually died. He was starting to suspect that the someone was not who Lucien thought it was. He went to Enzo's room. Enzo was in bed, his skin the color of old wax, the morphine drip clicking softly. Alessio sat in the chair by the bed and asked one question. "GodFather, did you know?" Enzo's watery blue eyes slid open. He looked at his boy for a long time. "Alessio," he said, "I raised you from the day your mother died. I taught you how to shave. I taught you how to hold a rosary. I taught you how to hold a gun. But there is one thing I never got to teach you, and I am running out of time. So I will not teach you now. I will let the world teach you. Go find her yourself. Alone. No soldiers, no weapon. Ask her to come home. Do not command her. Ask her. And Alessio, if you cannot ask, then you cannot inherit what I am about to leave behind. Do you understand me, boy?" Alessio understood nothing. Alessio understood everything. Both were true at the same time, and it broke him a little. He sat there in the chair beside the bed for a long while after Enzo drifted off again, listening to the click of the morphine drip and the soft rasp of the old man's breathing. And he thought about a night 38 years ago when Enzo had come into his bedroom with a fresh glass of water, because the boy Alessio had been crying about his dead mother, and Enzo had sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing, absolutely nothing, for 2 full hours, and that silence had been the kindest thing anyone had ever done for him. He understood, sitting in that same posture 40 years later, that Enzo was doing it again. Enzo was giving him silence, and silence was the only classroom left in which a man like Alessio Varnese could finally be taught. Enzo told him where to go. There was an old family funeral home on the west side, the Marcelli Funeral Home, boarded up since 1998, and Cora would be waiting there tonight at 11. Alessio was to walk in through the front door alone, without a gun, without a car, without a single one of the 22 soldiers who normally moved with him. Enzo said this the way a priest gives a penance. Alessio nodded like a boy. He drove himself. He parked 2 blocks away in a Buick he had not driven in 15 years. He walked the last 100 yards in the rain, past the shuttered pawn shops and the boarded-up laundromats of a neighborhood the Marcelli family had built and then abandoned. His shoes filled with cold water. Somewhere far off, a train sighed against the wet dark. The front door of the funeral home was unlocked. Above the lintel, the faded gold letters still read, Marcelli and Sons, Est 1946. A dead moth clung to the paint of the S. Somewhere inside, a battery lantern was burning, throwing a thin yellow line under the door. "Now, before I take you into that room with him, I want you to do something for me. Down in the comments, tell me one word. Just one. If you were Alessio Varnese, standing on the threshold of that abandoned funeral home in the rain, and you had thrown that woman out 3 days ago in front of every man who ever feared you. What would you say to her when the door opened? One word. I'll be reading them. Alessio pushed the door. It swung inward with a slow groan. Inside, the chapel was lit with 3 battery lanterns. The pews had been pushed against the walls. In the center of the room, on a low velvet stool, sat Cora Whitlock. She was still wearing the gray cotton uniform. Her hair was still pinned up. On her lap, she held the small black transmitter she had taken from his father's statue. Behind her, in a loose half-circle, stood Lucian Ferraro and 6 of the captains Alessio had trusted most in this world. Every one of them was armed. Every one of them was pointing a gun at Alessio. Lucian smiled with the top half of his face. "Boss," he said, "thank you for coming alone. I was worried you would be difficult." He gestured with his chin at Cora. "This is your traitor. She has been ours for 6 months. She built the network inside your house. She fed us your schedules. And when your godfather started sniffing, she smashed the statue so that she could hand us the master device before you found it yourself. She wants a payoff. I want your seat. And you, Alessio, have a choice. You put a bullet in her forehead right now, in front of these captains, and you keep your title as a figurehead under me. Or you refuse, and we bury both of you in the crematorium out back tonight." He drew a pistol from his coat and slid it across the wet floor. It came to rest at Alessio's feet. "Pick it up," Lucian said. "Prove you are still a boss." Alessio looked at the gun on the floor. He looked at Cora on the velvet stool. She was not looking at Lucien. She was looking at Alessio. Her eyes were completely calm. There was no fear in them. There was no plea. There was only a question. And the question was not, "Are you going to shoot me?" The question was, "Have you finally learned what my godfather sent you here to learn?" Alessio saw for the first time in 18 months the actual face of the woman who had brought him coffee every morning for a year and a half. The soft curve of her jaw, the small scar on her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the gray in the hair at her temple that she was too young to have. He saw a person, a whole person. He had housed her, fed her, and never once seen her. He knelt. Not because Lucian had told him to, not because he had lost the will to fight. He knelt in a puddle of his own rainwater on the linoleum of an abandoned funeral home, and he pushed the gun away with the back of his hand, and he looked up at Cora Whitlock, and he said the thing he had never said to another human being in his entire adult life. "Cora, forgive me. I threw away the only person in my house who saw me. I called it discipline. It was fear. If you can find one reason to come home, come home. Not as my maid, not as anyone's servant. Come home because I am asking. And if you cannot, I will still spend whatever is left of my life making sure the world is a little softer for you than it was under my roof." Lucian laughed. It was a short, ugly laugh. He raised his own pistol and aimed it at Alessio's forehead. "Weak," he said. "I actually thought you would kill her. Now I have to kill you both." Cora stood up from the velvet stool. She did not run. She simply lifted the small black transmitter in her right hand, and she pressed her thumb down on the tiny raised button in its center. Every door in the funeral home locked at once. Old iron bolts that had not turned since 1998 slid home with the sound of a coffin closing. The battery lanterns went out. Emergency red lamps, wired weeks ago into the funeral home's ancient junction box, came on instead, throwing the chapel into a blood-colored dusk. From the service corridor behind the pulpit, from the embalming room behind the flower alcove, from the loading bay behind the crematory, 22 of Enzo Marcelli's oldest and most loyal soldiers stepped into the room with their weapons raised. Tomas Belli walked in at the head of them, holding the folded slip of paper Cora had pressed into his hand at the front gate 3 nights before. Lucian Ferraro's captains lowered their guns. One of them was crying. 2 of them simply dropped their weapons on the linoleum and knelt without being told to. They had heard, playing softly from the funeral home's old speakers, the last 90 seconds of the recording Cora had triggered when she pressed the button. It was Lucian's voice. 6 months of Lucian's voice, naming names, naming prices, naming the day he intended to bury Alessio. Lucian turned his gun on Cora. Alessio moved faster than a man his age should have been able to move. He came off the linoleum in one long lunge, and he took the bullet in his shoulder that had been meant for her forehead, and he carried Lucian Ferraro backward into the pulpit with the whole weight of his body. They went down together in a tangle of arms and blood. When they came up, Alessio was holding Lucian's own pistol, and Lucian was holding nothing but air. And Alessio, breathing hard, pressed the barrel under Lucian's chin. 20 years, Alessio said. 20 years I trusted you. Lucian opened his mouth to answer. Alessio did not let him. The shot echoed off the vaulted funeral home ceiling, and then the room was very quiet. And then the surviving captains were on their knees with their hands behind their heads. Cora walked across the linoleum in her rubber-soled shoes. She knelt next to Alessio. She unbuttoned his shirt with the same steady hands that had once poured his coffee for 18 months, and she looked at the hole in his shoulder, and she said, "It missed the artery. You'll live." Alessio laughed, a broken, ragged laugh, and reached up and touched her cheek with his bloody thumb. She did not pull away, but she did not smile either. Enzo Marcelli was carried into the funeral home 20 minutes later on a stretcher, oxygen lines still running, and he explained everything in a voice that could barely lift itself above the sound of the rain on the roof. The transmitter in the statue had been his, not Lucian's. It had been broadcasting false information to a different suspect each week, and Lucian had reacted to each false lead like a mouse in a maze, drawing his own map of guilt. The 3 failed attacks had been Cora's work, 3 schedule changes she had quietly made in the householders before the statue meeting, changes that only she and Enzo had known about. Tomas Belli had never been the traitor. He had been Enzo's inside man from the beginning, taking his orders directly from the old GodFather, while allowing Lucian to route false transmissions through his security network, so that when the moment came, Lucian would come to this funeral home with every one of his conspirators, believing he had captured the family. He had captured nothing. He had walked into a coffin he had helped build. And Cora. Cora had been the eyes. Cora had been the hand. Cora had been the bait. Cora had walked out of the front gate of Alessio's house in her gray cotton uniform carrying the master device, knowing she would be humiliated, knowing she would be called a traitor, knowing that Alessio Varnese, the man who had never looked at her face, might very well hate her for the rest of his life. She had done it anyway, because Enzo had asked her to, because Enzo was dying, because if Alessio failed the test, the family would fall inside a month of Enzo's funeral, and 100 foot soldiers with wives and children would fall with it. "You used me," Cora said to Enzo, kneeling by the stretcher. Her voice was very quiet. "You used my dignity as a piece on your board." "Yes," Enzo said. He did not soften it. He did not apologize. "I am a dying man, child. I had one move left. I spent it on you because you were the only piece worth spending. Can you forgive me?" "I don't know yet," she said. Then Enzo turned his head, slowly, painfully toward Alessio, who was still sitting on the linoleum with his shoulder wrapped in Cora's makeshift bandage. "And you, boy," Enzo said, "you knelt, you asked, you did not command. That is the only reason you are still alive in this room. But I do not give you the family. She gives you the family, or she does not. Whatever she decides tonight, I will honor before I die." Every eye in the room turned to the maid in the gray cotton uniform. Cora Whitlock stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron out of pure 18-month habit, and then she looked down at the apron and very slowly untied it and let it fall to the linoleum. She walked to the center of the chapel. She looked at Alessio for a long time. "I will come back," she said finally. "But not to that house. Not the way I left it. I have 3 conditions, Mr. Varnese, and if you break any one of them, I will walk out of your gate a second time, and there will not be a third negotiation." "Name them," Alessio said. 1. I will never wear a uniform in your house again. I will never bring you coffee again. There is a woman in Rogers Park named Marisol who needs the job, and she will have it, and she will be paid what a human being is paid, and you will learn her name inside a week. Done. 2. The people who scrub your floors and cook your food and change your godfather's bedding will never again be treated as furniture. If one of them is fired, I hear about it first. If one of them is disrespected, you answer to me. Done. 3. She stopped. Her voice tightened for the first time all night. You will never, ever again use your rank as a substitute for an apology. Not with me. Not with anyone in your household. When you are wrong, you will kneel. Like you knelt tonight. In front of whoever you were wrong to. That is the price of the seat my godfather is about to hand you. Alessio Varnese, boss of the Varnese crime family of Chicago, 52 years old, bleeding from a bullet in his shoulder, looked up at the woman he had thrown out of his own house 3 nights earlier in the November rain, and he said the second most honest thing he had ever said in his entire adult life. Done, Cora. All 3. Come home. She did not answer him with words. She simply held out her hand. He took it with his good arm, and she pulled him up off the linoleum, and she held him steady while the world spun around him, and neither of them let go. Enzo Marcelli died 6 days later in his own bed in the Lake Forest estate, with Alessio holding one hand and Cora holding the other. He did not speak much at the end, but an hour before he went, he opened his eyes and looked at Cora and said, "Child, I picked you because you were the only person in that house who watched everyone and was watched by no one. Thank you for the last gift an old man could ask for. Thank you for making my boy human before I had to leave him." Cora bent down and kissed his forehead, and he closed his eyes, and he did not open them again. Alessio stayed in the chair for 2 more hours after the last breath left the old man's chest, holding a hand that was already growing cool, and Cora did not tell him it was time to stand up. She simply sat on the other side of the bed and waited, because she understood that grief is one of the few things a boss cannot delegate, and she had spent 18 months learning exactly how long Alessio Varnese needed to sit still before he could face a room full of captains again. The wake was held in the great room of the Lake Forest estate, in front of the fireplace where the marble statue of Alessio's father had once stood. There was no statue there now, and there would not be another one, because Alessio had ordered the mantle left bare. In its place, on a small velvet cushion, sat the shattered fragment of marble that Cora had picked up off the Persian rug on the night she was thrown out. Every captain who came to pay respects passed that fragment first. Every captain understood what it meant. The Varnese family would no longer worship stone. The Varnese family would remember, from this day forward, that the truth of a house is carried by the people who dust it, not the people who own it. Cora did not move back into the servants' wing. Alessio gave her the East Suite, 3 rooms with a private garden, and she took it. She did not become his mistress. She did not become his wife. Not that year. She became something the Varnese family had never had before. She ran the family's legitimate charitable foundation. She sat in on leadership meetings when she wanted to, and stayed out when she did not, and every captain who had once looked past her now stood up when she entered the room. Because every captain in the room had seen or heard the story of the boss of the Varnese kneeling on a puddle of rainwater in an abandoned funeral home and begging the maid he had thrown out. Marisol from Rogers Park was hired the following Monday. She was 51 years old, a widow, with a son in community college and a grown daughter working nights at a hospital in Evanston. She had scrubbed floors for 30 years and had never once been called by her first name in any of the homes she had cleaned. Alessio met her at the front door himself. He shook her hand. He said her name 3 times so he would not forget it. He introduced her to Cora in front of the whole household, and then he took Cora's hand in front of every one of them, and he said, "This is Marisol. She is the woman who will help us run this house, and this is Cora. She is the woman who runs my life." Marisol smiled. Cora did not smile, not right away. But her fingers tightened around his, and for a curvy, quiet 33-year-old woman in rubber-soled shoes who had once been invisible in this hallway, that tightening was louder than any wedding bell. If this story moved you, if you cheered when that maid pressed the button, if you felt something crack open when the boss of Chicago finally knelt, please do me one small kindness before you go. Hit the like button, share this with the woman in your life who has ever been called just the help, and subscribe to the channel, because the next story I am telling you is even more dangerous than this one, and I do not want you to miss the first minute. And tell me down in the comments, honestly, would you have forgiven Alessio the way Cora did, or would you have made him kneel a second time? I read every one of your answers, and I promise the next story is already waiting for you. He had thrown her away with a command. His godfather made sure that only begging could bring her back, and the woman in the gray cotton uniform, the one nobody in that mansion had ever bothered to see, walked back through the Varnese gate on her own 2 feet, in her own clothes, on her own terms, and the empire opened for her the way empires only ever open for the people who were never supposed to matter.